I think we'll bring up our next guest coming up here. Paul, we had Jenny on. Maybe one day you will meet Patty. But over here's a great picture of Jenny and Patty together with Paul. Behind him is the legendary picture that he had taken.
Yeah.
The Beatles with the Maharishi. This is going to be exciting.
It's coffee talk with the Tika. Nothing rhymes with that but chicken tikka. We name drop here with Stephen and all his friends.
Let's welcome Paul Saltzman right here to the audience, right here. People, welcome. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to our show, and wonderful to have you here. And man, so you were there, 67. Was it 67 that
68.
you were there? 68.
Yeah.
68. And then you made a documentary. You went back again.
I went back many times, but
Yeah.
I went back as well to make the documentary in 2018, 2017, 2018.
Wow. Pretty cool. What was it when you went back from then with the Beatles and when you were doing the documentary, how much has changed from now and then?
Well, the ashram was then a functioning ashram and lots of people, and it was closed to the public because the Beatles were there, but there were about 60 people from all over the world taking a 3-month course to be TM teachers. We didn't see them very much because they were off meditating and long hours and lectures and so on. And the famous folks, as I refer to them affectionately, the four Beatles, Pattie Boyd, George's wife, Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend, and Cynthia Lennon, John's wife, and Maureen Starkey, Ringo's wife. And then there was Mal Evans, their roadie, and Donovan, the wonderful folk troubadour and poet, Mike Love of the Beach Boys. There were basically 12 of them, and I kind of joined their group and hung out with them.
Wow. So when you went there, well, let's rewind a little bit. What brought you there, first of all, number one?
Well, what really started it all was that I was working for the National Film Board in Montreal. I was 23 years old. I thought my life was going very well. I'd already been the host or co-host of a national television show, a youth public affairs show. I'd already worked in the civil rights movement in Mississippi. I'd drove a sports car. I dated. I thought everything was good. And I woke up one morning in my little rented room in Montreal, and I was shocked with the thought that there were parts of myself I didn't like. I woke up one morning and thought, there are parts of myself I don't like, and I was a bit shocked. And I sat up on the edge of my bed and put my legs over the edge of the bed, and I said out loud without thinking. And the without thinking is a very important piece of this. The brain is a wonderful computer, but the heart is the guidance system. One of the most evolved teachers of consciousness I ever worked with said, if I had to sum up all my books and all my lectures into one sentence, I'd say it's all about integrating the head and the heart. All right? So I heard myself say out loud, without thinking, where do I go? And I heard my soul talk to me for the first time, and I didn't believe in a soul. I'd been brought up to believe. I was brought up as an atheist. My parents were sort of that way, and so there's no God, there's no soul, there's no spirit. That's just how I was brought up. But I heard this deep inner voice that was all calming, all knowing, all loving. And I'm saying these words carefully. Can you imagine the feeling of being all loved? It was like ecstatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard this inner voice, and it said, and these were its exact words, it said, hey, Paul, if you really want to look at yourself more carefully, you might want to get away from the environment you grew up in. And I said out loud, without thinking it, with this odd conversation, I said, where do I go? And that inner voice said, India. And that was the end of the conversation. And I had no connection with India, mysticism, meditation. I didn't know what any of that stuff was. It was, it was the fall of 1967. Meditation wasn't a word that was in the language like it is today. Yoga, who knew what yoga was? It was a sort of peripheral pastime from the East or something like that. It was a different world than it is today. mindfulness was not almost in the language then, except with people who found their way to mindfulness and the inner journey and yoga and meditation. None of it was common language. So that's how it started. And so I got myself a job. I didn't have the money to get to India. I got myself a job working on a National Film Board documentary in India. I knew the director who was going over. And what happened was I said goodbye to my girlfriend, Tricia. We loved each other a lot. I cried a lot. She cried a lot. We didn't want to part ways. I'd never been out of North America. It was a bit scary. And I took off for India and I worked on the film. And 6 weeks later, I knew that I was looking for a different me. I knew that I was trying to see if it was possible to change consciously who I was, this person who, didn't like parts of himself and didn't know myself well enough, right? Didn't know myself. And after 6 weeks of shooting across India, we got to New Delhi and I got a letter from her and I excitedly opened it. And the first line was, "Dear Paul, I've moved in with Henry." And I was devastated. I was shattered.
Dear Paul.
We've all had heartbreaks, I think, right? Most everybody has had a heartbreak at least. But this was the most devastating I experienced. And someone said, "Why don't you try meditation for the heartbreak?" Someone I knew for 3 days. He's American, named Al Bragg. I've been trying to find him to say, I said thank you way back then, but there's a whole different thank you I'd like to make to him. But there's many Al Braggs on the internet, and I haven't been able to find this one.
Mm-hmm. Here's your time right now. You go, "Hey, Al."
Hey, Al, thank you. And so he said, "I'm going to hear the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi speak at New Delhi University tonight." I didn't know who that was. "Would you like to come?" And I said yes. And we went, and there was, the auditorium was jammed. We got lost on the way. So by the time we arrived, it was just about to start. There were no seats. We pressed our backs up against the wall at the back. And I only remember one thing the Maharishi said, but it was the thing I needed to hear. It was the reason I, went there or got there or was guided to go there or was invited to go there. He said, "Meditation takes you beneath and below your daily worries and concerns to a place of inner rejuvenation from which you come back renewed and refreshed." And I thought, that's what I need. It was like, whoa, that's what I need. So I took a train to Rishikesh and I found my way to the ashram by asking people, do you know where the Maharishi's ashram is? I didn't know that Rishikesh had and still has many ashrams. But I found my way to the gate and they called someone at the gate who spoke English, a lovely young man named Raghvendra, who turned out to be my angel. I said, "I've come to learn meditation." And he said, "I'm sorry, the ashram's closed because the Beatles and their wives are here," which I didn't know. I was a fan. I saw them in '64 here in Toronto live. It was the most electric concert I've ever seen. I said to Raghvendra, who was about 32, 33, I had just turned 24. I said, "You have to teach me." And I told him about the heartbreak, what I was feeling. And he said, "I'll go and ask the Maharishi and I'll send you a cup of chai, but I won't be able to come back for 2 or 3 hours." And he left and someone from the kitchen came down with this incongruous white crockery tea set on a tray, hot milk and sugar and chai, Indian tea. And I poured myself a cup and I sat down in the dirt because it was a dirt path to the front gate. And I leaned up against the front gate and I waited. And 2 or 3 hours later, he came back and he said, "I'm sorry, the Maharishi says not at the present time." And I quite love language because there are many signposts in language, many meanings in language. And I don't know what I would have said if he hadn't said not at the present time, but I responded, "Can I wait?" Well, okay, not at the present time, but can I wait? And he was a little taken aback and he said, "Oh, okay." And he pointed across the dirt path and there was a couple of old army tents set up across the path. And he said, one of those is empty. You're welcome to sleep there, and we'll send you our simple vegetarian meal. So this man was an angel. He was an angel. I didn't know what to do. I was in agony. I didn't know where to go. He said, you can sleep there and we'll send you food. Yeah. And so I waited, and for all the reasons that I know and don't know, I waited outside the gate for 8 days.
Wow.
And I waited because I didn't know what else to do, and I was in pain. So I just waited, and finally he said, okay, it's time to come in. And he took me to a small meditation room. He taught me transcendental meditation. In that moment, it took 5 minutes. He gave me a mantra, a sound with which you, in this case, it was one word. Sometimes mantras can be 20 words, but this was one word. And he said, try it and see what you're experiencing. So I closed my eyes and I started saying the mantra inside. And after a minute or two, he said, what are you experiencing? And I said, well, my knees are hurting. I had never sat cross-legged on a floor, right? So all the muscles were wrong. It's like, I said, my knees are hurting and I'm distracted by the dog that's barking outside. And he said, well, when you get distracted, just don't wrestle with it. If you wrestle with it, you're out of the meditation. But if you get distracted, just choose to go back to your mantra. And he said, I'll now leave you alone to meditate on your own. You're now welcome to spend your days in the ashram and take your meals with us, were his exact words, but you'll still have to sleep in the tent because there's no extra rooms. I said, great, thank you. And he left me alone, and I meditated for 30 minutes, and it was an absolute miracle. What did I know? I came out of the meditation, and the agony in the heart was gone. I still loved Tricia. That took a couple of years to get over. I still wanted to get back with her, but the agony, the devastating pain in the heart, the knife in the heart was gone after 30 minutes. And I came out of the meditation room and I was in a state of bliss. I was stoned. I was high from the meditation. Wow. And wow. George Harrison later said to me, I get higher meditating than I ever did on drugs. And I knew what he meant because I'd experienced it. Anyway, I walked out into the sun and I'm walking through the ashram, which is pretty small. It's like, I don't know, a few acres, a bunch of acres. It wasn't big. And I wasn't thinking of Beatles at all. They were not in my mind at all. I was just so relieved not to be in agony. And I'm looking at the monkeys and the trees and these big, lovely green parakeets. And I'm walking through the ashram in a state of bliss. So that was, and then I saw them sitting at a long table by the cliff. But that was how I got to be there.
That's how you got to be there. Did you? When was the point when you started taking out the camera around them, or you were thinking, maybe I shouldn't do this around them right now? Is not the time.
Well, that's a great question because the answer is very interesting. Life is very interesting. I see them sitting at a long table by the cliff. I'm about 150 feet away. I can only see John, who's sitting semi-facing me, and I can see the back of Paul's head and the side of his head, so I can tell he's sitting talking to Paul. I can't see the rest of the people because of the trees and foliage, and I just walked over, but I was in this state of bliss, right? I was in this very calm inner state. I walked over, and when I got to the edge of the table, I could see that all the 12 people I mentioned, the famous folks, were sitting there having tea and cookies. And they were talking, so I didn't want to interrupt. So I just stood there. So I'm standing 1.5 feet from John and 1.5 feet from Paul on the other side. And after a moment, they clearly realized somebody was standing there. So they stopped talking and John looked up at me. And I just said, may I join you? And he said, sure, mate, pull up a chair. And Paul pulls a chair in next to the end of the table. And Paul says, come and sit here. And I sit down. And 3 magical things happened. Magical, I looked it up in the dictionary years later and found the meaning that I was really referring to. It says magical, that which is real, but we as yet do not understand, right? It's like a magic trick. Mm-hmm. It's real, mm-hmm. but it's not really. The ace of spades isn't really disappearing, right? But it is. So I sat down and 3 magical things happened. The first thing, as soon as I sat down, to my shock, I hear a scream in my head. Eek, it's the Beatles. Now, I never screamed, eek, it's the Beatles. I never spoke those words ever, but it was the fan, right? It was the fan coming out unexpectedly.
Of course.
And as soon as that finished, as soon as the fan finished, and again, without thinking is a key. Without thinking, I heard my soul talk to me for the second time in my life. Deep, resonant, all loving, all kind, calming. And my soul says to me, hey, Paul, they're just ordinary people like you. Everyone farts and is afraid in the night. That's what it said. And from that moment on, I spent a week with them, and I never thought of them as the Beatles. I literally never thought Beatles. To the point I spent a week and I only took out my camera twice, and I'll tell you how that unfolded, but I could have had my camera out all the time. I had lots of film. I only took 72 transparency, Ektachrome 64 colored slides, and of the 72 pictures, about 50 have anybody famous in them. It wasn't a thing. I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm going to get pictures of the Beatles. It wasn't literally. I didn't even think of saying, let's get a photo together. I could have had myself in pictures with them because they took me into their group. They just took me into their small group. I never thought of asking for an autograph. I mean, literally, I didn't think, oh, I'd like a photo. No, I shouldn't ask. The thought never entered my brain. So I just took out my camera twice. And I did that after asking them each individually, after the first 2 or 3 days of hanging out, and we're just hanging out and chatting, and they have cameras and they're taking pictures of each other like a family outing. And they were really like a very close family. You know, the four of them were like this. They were like intimate brothers. And you could kind of feel that the partners, the wives, Jane Asher, while close, although John and Cynthia weren't close, you could see that. You could tell that the wives were a next circle out. The inner circle was these 4 brothers who, you know, took the world by storm and were incredibly close. But after a couple of days of hanging out and seeing them taking pictures, I asked each of them individually, because it wasn't like, hey, Beatles, can I take your picture? I just said to Paul one day, are you okay if I take the odd photo? And I did that with each of them alone so they could feel free to say no. And they each said, oh, take all the photos you want. But like I said, I didn't take very many at all.
Okay. Sorry over there. Little technical difficulties. Okay. So you didn't take that many at all, but what you got was just magical. The word back to magical, because the natural lighting, you caught these moments of them working, first of all, one of their biggest records. That's a lot, double record, the White Album. And you were in the midst of it all, hearing all the outtakes right there that Corey, you and I wish we could hear. I mean, pretty.
Well, he was just describing the process of being accepted, and I think the Beatles drew a very thick line between friends and fans, and even their friends couldn't be fans because it just didn't sit well. They liked kind of what we do, busting each other's balls, and just to have someone go, well, it wouldn't have worked at all. And the only reason they accepted Paul and they let him so close was because that he had that attitude.
Yeah.
He was just there, and it wasn't a lie. And they had really good bullshit detector. Well, everybody but John had a really good bullshit detector. John had an awful one.
That is so wild you say that, because of all of the Beatles, you think he'd be the one that's like,
no.
Okay.
So Magic Alex. Do you remember Magic Alex? Do you remember this turd of a human being and the kinds of things he was telling John?
I don't, because I had left before Magic Alex came. He came.
Lucky you.
He came. I don't know when he came, but he came after I left. But I've read everything, of course. Not everything. I've read stuff and know the key parts of the story of how Magic Alex was pulling the wool over everyone's eyes, including John, saying he could do things that he couldn't do, and he got jealous of John's relationship with the Maharishi, so he made up the whole thing about the Maharishi having come on to They say Mia Farrow. It wasn't Mia Farrow. It was a nurse from California,
Oh, my God.
apparently. And he got the nurse from California to say this, to lie. And he started the rumor that Maharishi really wasn't vegetarian. He saw him eating chicken, which was a lie. And so Magic Alex really did twist John around in a way that was very ugly.
Yeah.
And he always insisted, Magic Alex, that he was right. But then the New York Times, some point way later, I don't know when, did a big investigation. They spoke to 20 people who were there, and they were about to come out with a major article of what really happened at the ashram. And Magic Alex threatened to sue, and the New York Times said, go ahead, sue us. And Magic Alex didn't, because he, in fact, had nothing to stand on. They had done their investigation, and they were right. He had made all this up, and he was a rather sad person in a certain way, I'd say.
Yeah, I believe that was Alan Cozen's article. He talked about that on a podcast.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
I gotta ask you. Okay, so here you took this pain in your heart. You go and you get your head together. You make this documentary, right? This comes out right here. What happened to Trisha?
Good question. In fact, no one's asked that. So really good question. I went home ostensibly to see if we could get back together. My best male friend and one of my best female friends, who were a couple, she was Trisha's sister. And in fact, I'd introduced that couple to each other. They came to pick me up at the airport, and they said, "Do you want to come home and see Trisha?" And for whatever reason, I was jet lagged. I was tired. I was still heartbroken. I just wasn't in agony. And I was afraid to go see her right then, being exhausted. And I said, no, maybe tomorrow. So they dropped me home, and then they went home to their place. And Trisha came running to the door. They told me later. She came running to the door, looking past them to see me. And I wasn't there. And she never wanted to see me again. We were too young. We were both in pain. We were both in heartbreak of a various kind. And we just, were like ships passing in the night. I did see her later, but she just wasn't interested in, and we didn't know how to talk to each other. We were young. She was 22 by then, or I was 24, barely. And instead of sitting down and saying, "Hey, are you okay? How are you doing?" Just having a real human conversation. We were too scared to sit down together. Now, years go by. I was broke, and I needed to make money. I needed to rent a flat. I wanted to say to people, whoa, there's this thing called meditation. I literally wanted to say, there's this incredible thing, you should check this out. So I went to Canada's national magazine, Maclean's magazine. They wanted the pictures that nobody had. I wanted to write about meditation, and I needed to make some money. So I did a story for them. They put it on the cover. It was a cover story. And I finished writing the story, and I submitted it, and I'm packing up my slides because I used them to guide me in part in the storytelling, looking at the pictures. And I packed up my slides, and I'm literally wrapping elastic around them and writing India 68 on them. And I realized I was feeling bad. I didn't know why. I was feeling badly for whatever reason. And I said out loud without thinking, there it is again. I said out loud without thinking, why am I feeling bad? And I heard my soul talk to me for the third time in my life. And it said, you're talking about this too soon. You need to let the experience go deeper within yourself. And I remember the next thought was, I don't want to do anything more with these, as I put the slides away. What I didn't know then, and I learned many years later, I didn't think about those slides for 32 years. Wow. I married an Indian woman, never told her I'd been in India with the Beatles. Had a daughter, never thought of saying, my two best friends, when I finally found the slides 32 years later, because my daughter remembered a childhood story and asked me if she could see them. And that, of course, is in the film, the story.
Yeah.
It was wonderful to make Meeting the Beatles in India, because I got to not only see Patty and Jenny again, I not only got to go find Bungalow Bill in Hawaii. I said to Ricky Cook, that's his real name, Bungalow Bill. They wrote the song about him. I'm sitting with him at his place in Hawaii, and we're filming. And I said to him, so when we finished filming, I said, so have a lot of people been here to interview? He said, you're the first.
That's crazy.
Crazy. And he's beautiful and wonderful. And of course, you saw in the film how Patty was so thrilled to hear about his change of heart from a white hunter to a photographer of wildlife for National Geographic and a meditator.
Yes.
So to make the film, to tell the story of how it all happened, to, in a sense, also pay tribute to all those people who were part of it, and to my daughter who's in the film, because without her, the pictures might still be sitting in a cardboard box in the basement without me thinking about it. So after I did find them, after she reminded me, I decided to do something with them. But I didn't know if they were worth anything. Were there lots of these pictures? And my daughter, Devyani, and I were going through London on the way to the Middle East. And I made an appointment to see Stephen Maycock at Sotheby's Auction House in London, because he was the curator for rock and roll memorabilia, and he was considered one of the top 2 or 3 experts in the world on rock and roll memorabilia, including photography. So I made an appointment to see him. And there was this really marvelous moment. We're sitting around a light box, and it's my daughter and me and him and his assistant in this room that was so small, literally our knees were touching each other around this light box. It was like a cupboard off a lobby, this room. And he takes a loop, the thing you look at the slide with. He takes a loop and he looks at the first slide. And without lifting his head, he goes, huh. And then he moves the loop and he looks at the second slide and he says, wow. And he sits up and he says to me, you sure you're not a professional photographer? And I said, no, I was just a kid with a camera. I've never been a professional photographer. Then he looked at the rest of the 54 slides with anyone famous in them. And he sat up and he said this sentence. It was so beautiful. He sat up and he said, we see everything for moments like this. Some of these are the best intimate shots we've ever seen of them. What do you want to do with them? I said, I don't know. What can I do with them? And he said, well, we can auction them off for you. And I said, well, who would buy them? And he said, well, it could be Apple, because they buy back everything they can to control the brand of the Beatles. It could be they. It could be a photo agency who will resell them. It could be a private collector who just wants them. And I said, so what might I get if you auction them? And he said, well, it depends who's in the room. 30, 40, 50,000 British pounds. Well, at that time, 50,000 pounds was over 100,000 Canadian dollars, which I could have used. But for some reason, and I think it's the inner guidance that was guiding me already, the soul, for some reason I said to him, gee, that sounds boring. Do you think there's a book here? And he said, I'm sure there is. And if I can ever help you, let me know. So I made an arrangement to do the first book with Penguin Putnam in New York. I called up Stephen Maycock and said, hey, will you write the introduction of the first book and just put the pictures in historical perspective like you did when I met you? And he said, sure, and he did that. And what happened was that the Penguin Putnam imprint that did my first book, the Viking imprint, the guy who ran the Viking imprint was, I'd say, a kind of frustrated painter who had a big attitude. And I said to him, I'd love to go over and see the book being printed. I'd already approved. I worked on the design. They sent me to Vancouver where the designer was. We did all that, approved all the pages. And then I said to him, I'd like to go to China on my own expense. I've never done a book. I want to see how it's done. And he put his hands up like this. I'm sitting across the desk. He puts his hands up like this and says, that's what we do. So he wouldn't tell me where it was being published. And I found out later that they never sent anybody to supervise, which I also found out later that with an art book or a photography book, you absolutely have to have either the artist, the photographer, or someone repping them who's on the printing presses saying, I approve it. Because what came back was a beautiful book that was poorly printed. There's pictures of George where you can't see his eyes because they're shadows. Well, you look at the original slide, you can see his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got the first print and I looked at it, I was delighted that the book was beautifully designed, and it is a pretty trippy book in its design and in everything else in the storytelling. But the pictures aren't they're not up to professional quality, because what they did was they picked the wrong paper to print on, and the paper soaked up the ink. This is what I found out later. So what happened was that I decided literally in that moment of looking at the first one I had in my hands, I thought, one day I'll do this myself to do it right. And so 5 years later, I could pull the money together. And I found a company that did limited edition books, because I didn't know how to do one. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know, And I said, I spoke to the head of the company, Insight Editions in San Francisco. The head of the company is a guy named Raoul Goff, who's a brilliant designer and a lovely human being and a brilliant businessman. They were doing limited edition books for George Lucas and, high-end stuff. And I said, I've got this stuff and I'd like to do a book. And he said, well, can you send me a few of the pictures? Low res. So I sent him a few of the pictures, and he called me back and he said, well, we'd be honored to publish it. And I said, thank you very much, but I want to pay for it myself. And I'd like you to manufacture it, but I'd like to put it out there because I want to retain control. And he said, we'd be delighted to do that. So I paid for the book. Interestingly enough, it cost me about $100,000, but I managed to pull that together.
Wow.
And that was 2004, 2005. And I put out a limited edition, big format, in a clamshell box with a DVD and a CD, and we printed the pictures beautifully. And they knew how to do this, and they weren't arrogant like the first person. So what you're looking at there is what's called the special edition. It's the lower priced one. There's 1,968 copies of that for the year 1968, and the box itself is wrapped in linen.
Okay.
And it's printed. The book itself is wrapped in linen, and it's printed on high quality photographic paper. And you look at the pictures, and yep, that's it. That's what the real pictures look like. So I was thrilled to do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm just like,
no,
I'm loving the pic. I'm just wowing. I think it's a great packaging. I like how you wrapped it up, and that's the way you wanted. Yeah, it's a fantastic job. So I didn't mean to cut you off.
The shot of all of them together. I understand that there were a couple of photographers who took that a similar shot, and that the one that you took was actually being used without and not credited, without payment. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I recall there were only two of us taking pictures. One was an old man, so he must have been about 40 to my 24. An old man, and he was a photographer from the town of Rishikesh that the Maharishi had arranged, and he came up with a big 8-inch by 10-inch plate camera, formal portrait camera. It was set up by the Maharishi, as I say affectionately, it's the class photo. It was to include all the meditators who were on the course, plus the famous folks who he put front and center, as you see there in the picture. And the Maharishi told everyone where to sit. He had a seating plan. He told everyone where to sit, and he directed the photographer, stand over there, please stand over there. But what happened was that I went and got my camera from the tent because all this was happening. It was one of the 2 times I took my camera out. And when I came back with my camera, Ringo, seeing me with my camera, calls me over and says, hey, can you take some pictures for me? And he gives me his Nikon because he's going to be in the picture. And seeing that, George says, can you take some pictures for us? And he gives me his camera. And Mal Evans says, can you take some pictures for me? And he gives me his camera. So there were only the two of us that I know taking pictures at that moment, but I had 4 cameras. And what you're referring to, Corey, was that I took pictures for Mal and George and Ringo. It turns out that when the anniversary was coming and I was put out the books and so on, I'd get interviewed a whole bunch, Time Magazine and Life and Japanese magazines and German magazines. And I would say, if you want any of the pictures, my agency in New York is Contact Press Images. You can make an arrangement to use pictures. And the articles would come out and I'd have given time to be interviewed and tell stories, which is fine. And they would never use my pictures because they could buy a picture from Mal Evans' camera much cheaper, because Getty Images had Mal's collection and they'll sell them for, $79 or $99 because they're selling, of course, a gazillion dollars of pictures a year. The Getty archive, the Getty agency is humongous. It turned out later that Getty had to make some kind of amends, because it turned out they were selling 20,000 photos they didn't have the rights to. They were just collecting and selling, and until you stood up for yourself, if it was one of these pictures that they didn't have the rights to. So I got in touch with Getty when these pictures were appearing and people weren't buying mine, and I just thought, hey, you're asking me my stories and my time, at least use my pictures. That's fair. I'm not being paid for the interviews. That's fair enough, right? And so what happened was I got in touch with Getty and they said bugger off. And I got in touch with their Canadian, and I got in touch with their Canadian lawyer because I'm in Canada. I thought that would work better. And she said, well, those aren't your pictures. Those are Mal Evans' pictures. Well, I'd already done my homework, and it turns out that the copyright for the picture is not from who owns the equipment. It's from who takes the photo. Who is the artist who frames the picture and sets the exposure. That's who owns the copyright. Because if you think of it, most movies are made on equipment that's rented. Well, it's not the camera company that owns the movie. It's the producers who own the movie. The camera company just rents. So it took me getting my lawyer involved, and it took a few $1,000s of legal fees. And they said, well, no, Mal took that picture. And I said, you see the guy fourth from the right in the picture? That's Mal. He couldn't have taken that picture. He gave me his camera. So finally, they got off their standard lawyer's position for the big corporation, which is bugger off, kid. And they said, okay, all right, we're not going to acknowledge that you took that picture, but we'll make a deal with you. Yeah. And so they paid me some back royalties, and they pay me a small amount of royalties now if they use the picture. And usually the picture that gets bought, I've sold some of mine through the agency for big articles, but usually magazines or newspapers will, of course, go for the cheapest picture you can get. It's not as good a picture in literal terms. I took it, but the facial expressions aren't as open and present and looking at the camera quite in the way as the main picture that I took. But that's all good. It's all good. Yeah. But that's the story behind that.
That is the story. I'm so curious about, because you mentioned Mal Evans, and he's somebody that I'm so interested about and don't know a lot about him. And unfortunately, his death was an awful way to go. Terrible. And what type of person was Mal, back then when you met him?
When I met him, he was this darling. He was this big, warm teddy bear of a guy. He was huge. He was kind. He was gentle. He was generous. One day, a few days after I joined the group, Mal and I were sitting alone. And it's the only time I asked a question like about them, the Beatles. And I just said to him, I didn't use the word Beatles because, like I said, I wasn't even thinking that. I just said to him, are they always this nice? And he said, yes, most of the time.
Most of the time. Yeah, he was everything to them. Their roadie, their right-hand guy, the protector. And And at the end of his life, he went to L.A. and I guess a lot of his stuff was missing even after death. I think his body or his ashes were missed. His ashes, I believe, he got cremated, and they were like missing.
I didn't hear that. What I did hear was that his widow, and he had 6 kids, and I don't know the story, but apparently he left his widow and 6 kids in relative. I don't know if poverty is the word, but they weren't well off. And he left them and took off for California. And again, I don't know the ins and outs of whatever that was. But apparently she found a big trunk in the attic, apparently, which had Beatles lyrics. Like, he was the one who would clean up the studio after recording sessions. And you didn't throw stuff out because somebody might get it and turn it into money. And the Beatles were very, very careful. And Apple is, to this day, to vigorously go after people they think are trying to harm the brand or trying to rip the brand off. They came after me on the film. They came after me on my book. They tried to tell me that I had no right to publish the pictures. That's wrong. As an artist, a photographer, I'm allowed to publish my stuff. What I'm not allowed to do is put pictures on a mug and sell it, because that's merchandising. And I've never done that. And I would never do that without permission, without making a deal. But I've never done that. But at any rate, apparently, as Stephen Maycock told me this story, that Mal Evans' widow contacted, and I think it was Stephen, I'm not sure, but an auction house, I think it was Sotheby's, to auction off this trunk of memorabilia because she needed the money. And apparently, whoever it was at Apple, I don't know if it was one of the Beatles or just their guy who runs their company, they just came down on her like a ton of bricks, said you've stolen them, which she hadn't, blah, 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 blah. And they got the trunk back.
Wow.
And so she was out of luck on that one.
Wow. There's an interesting story, which I was, I don't know if you know about it, Corey. Yes.
You go ahead, but you asked me whatever happened to Trish, and I forgot to tell you the final beat.
Yes, please do. So,
years later, Trish is married to someone who had been my best friend, and she has 4 children. And my first book comes out, and I do a gallery opening I'd never shown the pictures, so I had the book to launch and the pictures to launch at a gallery here in Toronto. And it was a great opening. There were like 300 people. It was like a wonderful party, loving, caring, amazing photos, blah, blah, blah. So I invited Trisha and her husband and her 4 kids. And we're standing there in this crunch of people, having a glass of wine. And one of her sons is a crazy Beatles fan, and he is just so excited to be there. And I said to Trisha, very lightly, I said, I have to thank you. Without you, these wouldn't exist. And we all had a good laugh.
You got the best consolation prize for a broken heart that anyone has ever gotten.
That is true. That is true. Except maybe for the wives of gazillionaires who walk away with $8 billion. I don't mean that to sound the way it sounds, but as an independent filmmaker, the creative comes relatively easy to me. The tough part is always finding financing. That's the tough part. But yes, it was a great. The
most important thing. Did you give her a free book, or you made her buy one? That's what I need to know.
I don't remember, but knowing me, I would have given free books.
You would have given a free book, because I'm glad you brought back the Trish and brought us back. That's Paul. Thank you very much, because you're known to give away free. You had MPL, Paul McCartney's business, looking out for one of your photographs he wanted to use on one of his shows in the big screen. Tell us on that story. I don't know if Corey, you noticed.
It's a fun story. Sorry, Corey. Did you want
that? But that had to have been the '89 World Tour, because he had a film that he put on before.
It was the benefit concert at Radio City Music Hall.
Yeah. For the Maharishi
For David Lynch Foundation for Transcendental Meditation. Yeah, well, I was in my house right here, It would have been, I forget, 2007 or 8. I can't remember when that was, 2009. And the phone rings. And I pick it up and I say hello. And a woman says, "Is this Paul Saltzman?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Is this the Paul Saltzman that was in Rishikesh?" And I was like, "Yes, who's this?" And she said her name. I'm forgetting her name right now. She said, I'm in charge of audio, visual, and photographic material for MPL, Paul's company. Paul asked me to phone you. I said, "Well, that's very sweet." She said, "We're doing this concert at the Radio City Music Hall to benefit meditation and the David Lynch Foundation. And the second last song Paul's going to sing is called Cosmically Conscious. And he'd like to use your photographs to do a slideshow to project on the whole back of the stage, project really large. Would that be possible?" And I'm gonna just for fun, I'm gonna act this out for you.
Yes, please.
Would this be possible? Sure. How much will that cost? Nothing. Gratis. I wouldn't have these pictures without their kindness. Beat. Silence.
You asked to meet him.
Silence. Silence. It went on that long. Silence. It went on long enough that I said, "Why does that surprise you? This has never happened before," she said. "What do you mean?" I say. And she says, "Well, when people find out it's Paul McCartney, they want a lot of money." And I said, "Well, I get it, but no, I don't want anything. Because like I said, I wouldn't have these pictures without their kindness." I said, "On one condition." And she said, "What's that?" And I said, "That you give me a copy, a high-res copy of the slideshow for my archives, which are collected by the University of Toronto Media Archives." And she said, "Fine." And we did a one-page agreement, and I uploaded the files in very high res, which I've never done, but she assured me that McCartney was absolutely ferocious about protecting copyright and imagery, and that they agreed they would wipe all files from the designer, from the lab, from anywhere that they were, so that he could use the pictures, but nobody could rip them off. And so that's what happened.
Wow. What a wild story. So in the end, you actually went.
Sorry, let me just turn off.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We'll edit this out. Don't worry. Get it. It might be Paul McCartney.
No, it's actually my lovely daughter, but I'll tell her, I'll just text her and say I'll call her back.
That's okay.
Don't forget what you were going to say.
Corey, remember what I'm going to say for me.
Ha ha.
I would have asked to have him to reunite in person with
I would
Paul.
just want to see the show.
Yeah. So you got. Did you get to shake hands with McCartney? And
you know what's really interesting? The woman on the phone said, "Would you like 2 tickets for the concert?" And I had an engagement to do a screening and a Moving Beyond Prejudice seminar at a university that same day. And I don't believe in canceling out. I don't believe in taking a better offer. I don't believe in taking home someone else from the dance. You know what I mean? So yeah. I said, "Thank you very much, but I can't come." And that was, I would have loved to have come. Wow. What a concert.
I mean, Paul, you have such a mellow personality. I need a little of what you got. And I don't know if you learned it from that trip going to India, because here you are. And I know, and I watched a bunch of documentaries about you, a lot of interviews I watched about you, and everybody asked the same question, but some of my people probably never watched those documentaries, saying, "How the heck did you have these pictures just hidden of the Beatles?" Like, I know, Corey, we all think that, even though you.
Well, I want to get. I was with the Beatles in India.com as soon as the internet came out.
Oh, yeah. It's like, right? It was just, how do you put the world's biggest band in a closet or in an attic, and you just, I forgot about it. It just happens to be a picture.
So there's a real answer to that, and it's a very interesting answer. And I didn't learn this till years later in just becoming more conscious and wanting to become more conscious, because the answer to consciousness is that you want to. Consciousness is noticing. Consciousness is being aware. It's no magic thing. If you want to be more conscious, if you want to be conscious, you just decide you want to be, and you pay more attention to life and all that. So the answer to that, which I didn't learn till later, is that the way the subconscious works is it takes things literally. So if you say, did you ever have the little engine that could as a childhood story?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens? The big engine say, no, we could never get over those mountains, so you can't get over that mountain. And the little engine says, I think I can, I think I can, I can, I can. Now, in a sense, whether the author knew it or not, that was a story to me of the subconscious. It doesn't mean if you think you can fly out a 34th floor window, you better not do that. But it means that, so when I put the slides away, and when my soul said, you're talking about this too soon, you need to let the experience go deeper. And I thought, I don't want to do anything more with this. My subconscious took that thought, and that was it. I never thought about them for 32 years. I was going to say, when I went to do my first book, I wanted to go back to the ashram. I hadn't been there in 33 years. And I say to my best male friend, who had been my best friend for 20 years, and my best female friend, I said, I'm going to India. They said, why are you going to India? I said, I'm going to write a book. They said, what are you going to write a book about? I said, I'm going to write a book about the Beatles in India. Why are you going to write a book about the Beatles in India? Well, I spent a week with them in 1968. You know what they both said? You never told us that. It was just, it wasn't a party story.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, look at me, I spent time with the Beatles and I have these pictures. It's never been about that. The reason I made my film, which I put myself in because it's a personal journey story, and the reason I did that was I wanted to make a film about creativity, meditation, the inner journey, which I didn't know about till I heard Tomorrow Never Knows. When I'm listening to, and you saw that in the film, that's part of the story. It was the Beatles who first opened my consciousness to, is there something inside? Is there an inner journey? I didn't know.
That's the album.
Yeah, that's the album.
Yeah. What a heavy song, too, which Tomorrow Never Knows was supposedly, and I don't know if this is true, maybe Paul knows the answer, Corey, Peter Fonda. Here's an influence.
Well, yeah,
on
of course.
Yeah.
No, that was She Said, She Said, not Tomorrow Never Knows.
Oh, it was. It was She Said. I got a fact. I don't win Paul's box set of the book today. Paul, what do you have in your closet that maybe that you don't want that you might have forgotten? Because we might be able to get some investor right now and have something big here.
There isn't anything.
Are you sure? Do I need to come over? Come on.
I took out all the, in my film, I have some film footage that's never been seen, and I have about 20 to 30 photographs that have never been seen, not just a few of my own, but a few of other people. I found by serendipity a young woman in England, well, older than you folks, young to me, whose mother was one of the meditators at the ashram. And she was kind enough, she had Polaroid pictures, or the equivalent of Polaroid pictures her mom had taken at the ashram, just as one of the meditators. And she allowed me to license them and pay her a bit and put them in the film. So my film has about 20 or 30 photos never before seen, and about 2 minutes of film footage never before seen. But otherwise, I used everything I could, including scouring the various archival footage repositories.
Yeah, I will say this: the documentary is an excellent documentary right here. You know what, everybody, you got to check it out. Very touching with you and your daughter talk, and actually with you going back there, because when we first had Jenny Boyd, I didn't see your documentary yet, and I asked her, "Is it still exist? What's it look like? All this?" And you take us back there. There's some, difference, a long time passing, but
Sure.
It's just so incredible just to go back there, and it actually. It's a great thing to make people want to take a vacation to go to India, all the Beatle fans to go back out there.
It's very interesting you say that, because I have a hobby. I lead small tour groups to India. And the reason I do that is because many, many people over the years have asked me about what it was like and what's India like. And I've heard many times the same sentence. I've always wanted to go to India, but it scares me. And I would say, why does it scare you? And they would say, the heat or the food or the poverty or the disease. And I would never try and convince anybody. I just say, well, here's my experience. I've been there over 60 times. I don't know how many now. And one day, a young man in his 20s said to me at the end of one of these conversations, he said, "Would you ever take anyone?" And I said, "What a nice idea." So I lead small tour groups to India for the joy of sharing India. We start in the deep south. We go all the way up and end up at the ashram. And we end up with 3 peaceful days on the Ganges in Rishikesh. But that's just to share my joy of India. It's not about making money. It's just about, just to share the joy of the Beatles and the ashram and India. And it's a trip that's 80% India and 20% Beatles.
Yeah, I love it. That's a trip that I definitely would want to go to.
So cool.
Paul, I know you have to go. I have to put a request right now before I have my wife write to you. I need a part 2 because I want to talk about prom night in Mississippi. That's a whole nother subject.
Sure.
And I want to get that like ASAP with you. You're a lovely soul, a lovely person. I'm very honored that you spent the time with us and gave us the time.
It's a pleasure.
To all of you, thank you very much.
A part 2 for sure. We got to do a part 2.
Whenever you want.
You got it. Everybody, please check out the documentary, Wonderful Meeting the Beatles in India. And I'll put the links where you could go look for the book, The Beatles in India. There's a high end, there's a lower end. I'll get any end. The book looks great. That's when I went, wow, and cut you off. But Paul, thank you. Give our love to your daughter because she's the reason that we got the pictures back. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for coming on here. We'll let
Thank you, all of you. Corey, Miranda, thank you. Please thank Amber for me.
I will. And all the links will be in here. You could follow Paul and get all his good stuff. Big love to you, Paul. Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
It's coffee talk with the Tika. Nothing rhymes with that but chicken tikka. We name drop here. We're Stefan and all his friends.
You guys got me right there. I'm just reading my friend's. Oh, Susan, you're here too. I'm just happen to be reading your book. I want to share everybody out there in the world. Please, everybody, please check it out. I will put all the good descriptions right there. But that's our friend Susan. And before we go, thank you guys. But click up there, click over here, up there, there, and remember. Subscribe, share, love one another, and always be steepling. Right, Dr. G? Always steeple, huh, Dr. G? That's right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.